She fined me $600 for fishing, but forgot one line that cost her the entire lake. I'd been fishing the same Montana lake every Saturday for 12 years when HOA President Diane Whitmore walked down to the shoreline and handed me a $600 citation. She said I was violating HOA rules. Then she threatened to call the police. Most people would have argued. Most people would have paid. But when I looked at that notice, I saw one small detail missing. A detail that shouldn't have been missing if the HOA really owned the lake. What started as a fishing fine turned into a paper trail, a sheriff's visit, a hidden secret buried in county records, and a discovery that changed everything. By the time the truth surfaced, the person handing out the fines was facing questions she couldn't answer. And before we get into it, if you enjoy stories about property rights, common sense, and ordinary people standing their ground the right way, consider subscribing. Now let me show you how a $600 fishing ticket led me to legally buy a 42-acre lake. The first cast of the morning landed exactly where I wanted it. The lure touched down near a cluster of reeds along the eastern bank of Cedar Hollow Lake, sending a small ripple across the glassy water. I eased back in my folding chair and watched the line settle. For 12 years, that had been my Saturday routine. Coffee in a thermos, fishing rod in my hands. No phone, no meetings, no problems. After 30 years designing water systems and civil infrastructure projects across Montana, retirement had taught me to appreciate silence, especially this kind. The shoreline sat less than 200 yards behind my ranch house. A dirt path curved along the lake edge, passing cottonwoods and old fence posts that had been there long before Maple Ridge Estates was built. Residents walked dogs there. Kids skipped rocks. Retirees sat on benches and watched the sunset. Nobody owned the memories. Nobody questioned the arrangement. At least nobody had until Diane Whitmore became HOA president. I heard tires crunching gravel before I saw her. A white SUV rolled into the small parking turnout near the path and stopped hard. The driver's door opened. Diane stepped out. Even from 50 yards away, she looked like she was heading into a board meeting instead of a lakeshore. Pressed blazer, clipboard, perfect hair. Behind her climbed Greg Dalton, the HOA secretary, carrying a manila folder under one arm. Neither looked happy, huh? I sighed. Nothing good ever arrived with a clipboard. They marched directly toward me. Neither bothered with a greeting. "Mr. Mercer?" Diane's voice carried across the water. I reeled in a few feet of line and looked up. "Morning." She stopped beside my chair. Greg immediately pulled a document from the folder. Diane pointed toward my fishing rod. "You are currently engaged in unauthorized fishing activity on HOA-controlled property." I blinked once. "Am I?" "Yes." She sounded very pleased with herself. Greg handed me the paper. Across the top, in bold red letters, was the phrase, "Notice of Violation." Below that, Article 7.4 Unauthorized Aquatic Activity Fine, $600. I read it twice, then a third time. The amount didn't surprise me. Diane had become famous for finding new ways to fine people. Mailbox colors, holiday decorations, boat trailers. One neighbor got cited because his shed roof was apparently the wrong shade of brown. But fishing? That was new. I looked up. "I've fished here every Saturday since 2012. Diane folded her arms. "Previous enforcement failures do not invalidate current regulations." I almost laughed. Only Diane could make fishing sound like a criminal enterprise. Greg was already writing something on his clipboard, probably documenting my reaction. I looked back down at the citation. "Can you show me the documentation establishing HOA ownership of the lake?" The question hit harder than I expected. For a split second, Diane froze. Not long. Not just enough. Then her expression hardened. The lake is community property. That's not what I asked. The association exercises jurisdiction over this area. I nodded slowly. Based on what deed? Greg stopped writing. Diane's jaw tightened. The silence stretched. A fish surfaced 20 feet offshore and disappeared again. Finally, Diane said, "The board is not required to justify community regulations to individual residents." There it was. Not an answer. A dodge. Engineers spend enough years reviewing contracts and specifications that they develop a habit. When someone avoids a direct question, you pay attention. I folded the citation in half, then in half again. That's not a deed. Diane took a step closer. Mr. Mercer, if you continue fishing after receiving this notice, I will contact law enforcement. I stared at her. Not because the threat worried me, because it didn't make sense. People who possess authority usually point to documents. People who don't possess authority point to titles. Diane loved titles. HOA president, board chair, community representative. Every conversation eventually circled back to one of them. You're going to call the sheriff because I'm fishing? If necessary. I glanced at the lake, then back at her. You do what you think you need to do. That answer seemed to irritate her more than an argument would have. She clearly expected resistance, maybe anger. Instead, she got a man sitting in a folding chair holding a fishing rod, her lips compressed into a thin line. We'll be documenting any further violations. Greg scribbled again. Then the two of them turned and walked back toward the parking area. I watched them leave. The SUV disappeared around the bend. The lake became quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. I looked down at the citation. Something about it bothered me. Not the amount, not the language. Something else. I unfolded the paper and studied it carefully. Years spent reviewing engineering contracts had trained me to look for missing information as much as present information. Half the time, mistakes weren't hidden. They were omissions. My eyes moved line by line. Violation number, date, time, officer signature, fine amount. Then I reached the location field. I stopped. Location of violation, lake area, common grounds. That was it. No parcel number, no tax identification, no legal description, no assessor code, nothing. I stared at the blank space beneath the line. A property violation without a property. An ownership claim without ownership information. That wasn't normal. That wasn't even sloppy. It was strange. I folded the citation slowly and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I reeled in my line and stood. The fish could wait. Because for the first time that morning, I wasn't thinking about fishing. I was thinking about why an HOA would issue a property violation while avoiding the one detail every legitimate property document always contained. And as I walked back toward my ranch house, one question followed me all the way up the hill. If Diane Whitmore was so certain the HOA owned Cedar Hollow Lake, why wasn't the parcel number on the citation? That question stayed with me the entire walk back to the house. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write an email. I didn't march into the HOA office demanding answers. Years of engineering work had taught me that assumptions are expensive. Documents are cheap. You start with documents. I sat down at my desk overlooking the lake and pulled my laptop closer. The county assessor's website wasn't complicated. Every parcel in the county had a record somewhere. House lots, commercial property, pasture land, waterfront acreage. If Cedar Hollow Lake belonged to the HOA, proving it should take less than 5 minutes. I typed in the subdivision name, Maple Ridge Estates. Dozens of parcels appeared. Lot 1, Lot 2, Lot 3. Road easements, common green spaces. stormwater retention areas. Everything was listed. Everything had a parcel number. Everything except the lake. That caught my attention immediately. I zoomed into the county GIS map. The blue shape of Cedar Hollow Lake sat in the middle of the development like a missing puzzle piece. Every property surrounding it carried ownership information. The lake itself carried a separate designation. Parcel 4-2-1178. I clicked it. The owner field appeared. I expected to see Maple Ridge Estates, HOA. Instead, I saw something else. Cedar Hollow Development Group, LLC. I leaned forward. The name meant nothing to me. The status field underneath caught my eye. Entity dissolved 3 years ago. I read it twice. Then a third time. The HOA wasn't listed anywhere. No ownership transfer, no management agreement, nothing. Just a dissolved company that technically still owned 42 acres of water and shoreline. My curiosity became something else. Suspicion. I spent the next 2 hours pulling every public record connected to Parcel 4-2-1178. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The subdivision had been developed nearly 20 years earlier. Homes had been sold, roads transferred, utilities transferred, common areas transferred. Yet somehow the lake never moved. It remained attached to the original development company, a company that no longer existed. I printed everything: ownership records, tax records, subdivision plats. Then I found the HOA governing documents online, the CC and Rs, 200 pages of regulations, restrictions, and definitions. Most people never read them. I did. Twice. Page 73 finally gave me what I was looking for. Common area. Any property deeded to and maintained by the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The wording was clear, painfully clear. No deed, no common area, no common area, no authority. At least not under the HOA's own rules. I leaned back in my chair. Outside my window, the lake sat exactly where it had sat all morning. Nothing about it looked different, but everything had changed. The fine in my pocket suddenly looked less like enforcement and more like theater. My printer finished another page. I picked it up. Annual tax statement. Parcel 4-2-1178. Taxes delinquent. 3 years. That was unusual. If the HOA truly controlled the lake, somebody should have been paying those taxes. Apparently nobody was. My phone rang. The screen showed Ethan Walker, my nearest neighbor, ranch owner, retired firefighter. One of the few people in the subdivision who still believed facts mattered. "You hear what Diane's telling people?" he asked without greeting. "Probably. She's saying you got cited for violating community water regulations." I laughed. That didn't take long. Folks are talking. Let them. A pause. "You okay?" "I'm fine. You don't sound angry." "I'm not." That wasn't entirely true. I was irritated. But anger makes people rush. I didn't want to rush. Not yet. "Something going on?" Ethan asked.
I agree.
I looked at the stack of records beside me. "Maybe. That's all you're giving me?" "For now." He chuckled. "Whenever you get quiet, somebody else usually gets nervous." After we hung up, I returned to the records. The dissolved company fascinated me. Because if the HOA didn't own the lake, and the developer no longer existed, then somebody eventually would. The question was who? I opened another county filing. Corporate dissolution notice. Asset disposition requirements. Residual property. My eyes stopped moving. Then I read the paragraph again. Dissolved corporate assets could be transferred, sold, or liquidated through legal disposition proceedings. Sold. The word sat there quietly, waiting. I stared through the window toward Cedar Hollow Lake. The same lake Diane claimed belonged to the HOA. The same lake she'd just fined me $600 for fishing in. A thought formed, then another. Neither of them went away. By sunset, I had one folder containing every public document connected to the lake, and one growing question. Not whether Diane was wrong. She was. The records already proved that. The real question was something much bigger. If the HOA didn't own Cedar Hollow Lake, who was eventually going to? That question stayed in my head for 2 days. Not because I had an answer, because I couldn't stop finding more questions. The dissolved development company had left behind a lake, 42 acres of shoreline, and 3 years of unpaid taxes. None of that happened by accident. Somebody had known. The question was who. I called my daughter Rachel on Tuesday afternoon. She answered on the second ring. Dad. You busy? When you start with that question, the answer usually doesn't matter. I smiled. Fair. Rachel was a real estate attorney in Billings. She spent her days dealing with title disputes, easements, and people who signed documents they never bothered to read. If anyone could make sense of what I was finding, it was her. I emailed everything. The citation, the assessor records, the HOA bylaws, the dissolution filings. An hour later, she called back. The first thing she said was, "This is weird." That got my attention. Rachel didn't use words like weird very often. What do you see? I see an HOA acting like it owns something it doesn't own. That's what I thought. No, she said. You think they're mistaken. A pause. I think somebody already knows. I leaned back in my chair. The lake sat beyond the window, still quiet, still unchanged, yet every day it seemed to become more valuable. Rachel continued. The bylaws are clear. The lake isn't listed among HOA assets. I found that. I know. And? And somebody on that board should know that. That sentence stayed with me after the call ended. Somebody should know. By Wednesday morning, Diane's response arrived. Not through a lawyer, not through official channels, through gossip. The monthly HOA newsletter appeared in every mailbox across Maple Ridge Estates, including mine. I unfolded it at the kitchen table. Halfway down page 2 sat a section labeled Community Compliance Update. No names appeared, not officially, but there was no doubt who it referred to. A resident has recently engaged in activities inconsistent with community standards and has challenged established HOA authority regarding common recreational areas. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was transparent. Diane wasn't trying to enforce rules anymore. She was trying to control the narrative. The article continued. Residents are reminded that attempts to undermine community governance may negatively impact property values and neighborhood harmony. Property values. That was Diane's favorite phrase. Whenever she wanted people scared, property values appeared. I folded the newsletter and tossed it onto the counter. An hour later, Ethan Walker called. You famous now, I saw. People are talking. They usually are. This one's different. That caught my attention. How? Diane's telling people you're trying to take away lake access. I stared out the window. Interesting. The woman accusing me of taking something away was the same woman who couldn't prove she owned it. That felt important. Anything else? I asked. Ethan hesitated. Then he said something unexpected. Tom Fletcher came by yesterday. I knew the name. Tom was the HOA treasurer. Quiet guy. Rarely attended public arguments. Mostly handled numbers. What did he want? He asked whether I thought the board had authority over the lake. That made me sit upright. That's a strange question. Exactly. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Ethan added, he looked nervous. After we hung up, I pulled the corporate records back onto my screen. There had to be something missing. A transfer. A filing. A deed. Some paper trail connecting the lake to the HOA. But every search ended the same way. Nothing. The lake simply stopped, like somebody had forgotten to finish the paperwork. By Thursday evening, Rachel called again. This time, she sounded excited. Dad, I found the probate firm. What probate firm? The law firm handling the dissolved company's remaining assets. I sat forward. This was the first genuinely new lead we'd uncovered. What do they have? I don't know yet. But they still have the file. That was enough. The file meant records. Records meant answers. Rachel continued. I already requested copies. How long? Few days. I thanked her and ended the call. For the first time all week, I felt the balance shifting. Not much. Just a little. But enough. Then my phone buzzed. A new email. From Maple Ridge Estates, HOA. Sender, Diane Whitmore. Subject. Second notice of non-compliance. I opened it. The original $600 fine had been increased by administrative penalties. Now it was $750. Payment due immediately. Failure to comply may result in further enforcement action. I stared at the screen. No parcel number. No ownership records. No proof. Just a larger threat. I closed the email. Then I saved a copy. Because Diane Whitmore kept making the same mistake. She believed authority came from sending notices. I believed authority came from proving claims. And somewhere inside the file Rachel was about to receive, I had a feeling there was a document Diane desperately hoped nobody would ever read. Because if the HOA truly owned Cedar Hollow Lake, the paperwork would already exist. So why did every new document seem to point in exactly the opposite direction? I got my answer the following Monday. Rachel called before 8 in the morning. Dad, are you sitting down? That was never a casual question coming from an attorney. I'm listening. The estate file came in. I grabbed a notebook. What did you find? For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she said 4 words that changed everything. You were right again. My pulse quickened. Rachel rarely sounded surprised. This time she did. The lake was never transferred. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking Cedar Hollow Lake. 42 acres of water. Years of HOA control. Hundreds of residents using it. And not one legal ownership document. Nothing? I asked. Nothing. No deed? No. Management agreement? No. Lease? No. Rachel exhaled. The HOA has exactly 0 ownership interest. I stared across the shoreline. Every accusation Diane had made, every citation, every threat, every newsletter, all of it rested on nothing. Then Rachel said something even bigger. There's another document. I stopped moving. What kind of document? A request letter. From who? The HOA. That got my attention immediately. Rachel continued. The letter is 3 years old. Signed. Personally signed by Diane Whitmore. I felt a cold shift in my stomach. Now we were getting somewhere. What does it say? Rachel shuffled papers. Then she read aloud. Maple Ridge Estates. Homeowners Association respectfully requests administrative transfer of Lake Management Authority regarding Parcel 4-2-1178 for the purpose of community stewardship and recreational oversight. I said nothing. The implication was obvious. Diane had requested control, which meant she knew she didn't already have it. Rachel continued reading. The request was denied. There it was. The missing piece, the twist. The reason Diane never answered my question. The reason she never produced a deed. The reason the parcel number was missing from the citation. She already knew. For 3 years she had known. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Rachel said, "Dad, this changes everything." No. I looked toward the lake. It confirms everything. By noon, Rachel had connected me with the law firm handling the dissolved company's remaining assets. A partner named Samuel Grant took the call. Professional. Direct. No nonsense. Exactly the kind of lawyer I liked. He confirmed the lake remained part of the corporate estate. He confirmed the unpaid taxes. He confirmed there were no competing ownership claims. Then he asked a question. "Mr. Mercer, are you calling because you're interested in the property?" I glanced toward the water. For a second, I imagined Diane's face if she heard that question. Then I answered, "Possibly." Samuel laughed softly. "You're the first person who's called in 4 years. That surprised me. Nobody else wanted it?" "The HOA tried." I smiled. Of course they had, but they never submitted a purchase offer. Just a request for control. Exactly. The call lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, I had numbers, tax liabilities, transfer costs, title requirements, everything necessary to purchase the parcel legally. Nothing was impossible. Nothing was even particularly complicated. The lake wasn't trapped in litigation. It wasn't tied up in bankruptcy. It was simply waiting for someone to claim it properly. For the first time since receiving the citation, I felt the balance of power shift. Not publicly, not visibly, but underneath everything. The foundation had started moving. That evening, another HOA email arrived. Subject: Final notice of non-compliance. The fine had increased again. Now it stood at $900. The message threatened liens, legal action, community sanctions. I read every word, then saved a copy. Because the more Diane escalated, the more valuable her emails became. Every threat created another timestamp, another record, another piece of evidence. At sunset, I sat on my porch with a folder full of documents spread across the table. The citation, the ownership records, the denied transfer request, the estate paperwork, the tax records. For the first time, the entire picture was visible. Diane hadn't made a mistake. Mistakes happen once. This was something else. She knew the HOA didn't own the lake. She had tried to gain control. She had failed. Then she continued acting as though ownership existed anyway. That realization changed the nature of the fight. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was deliberate. My phone rang. Rachel again. "One more thing." "What?" "The estate is willing to sell immediately." I sat quietly. The lake stretched across the fading light beyond my ranch. For 12 years, it had simply been part of the landscape. Now it was becoming something else. An opportunity. A solution. Maybe even a weapon. Rachel waited. "You still there?" "Yeah." "What do you want to do, what?" I thought about Diane. The citation. The threats. The newsletters. The sheriff she promised to call. Then I thought about the denied request sitting in my folder. 3 years ago, she had tried to get control of Cedar Hollow Lake. Now there was a chance someone else could own it outright. I looked out at the water one last time. Then I gave Rachel my answer. Move forward. Because for the first time since Diane handed me that $600 fine, I wasn't asking who owned the lake anymore. I was asking a very different question. Would Diane discover what was happening before the sale was complete? For nearly 2 weeks, the answer appeared to be no. The purchase process moved quietly. Rachel handled the legal filings. Samuel Grant handled the estate paperwork. Title searches were ordered. Tax obligations were calculated. Every step happened exactly the way property transfers are supposed to happen, slowly, methodically, and on paper. Meanwhile, Diane kept doing the opposite. The fines continued. The emails continued. The rumors continued. Every few days, another notice appeared in my inbox. The amount climbed past $1,000. Then $1,500. The numbers didn't matter anymore. The lake did. One Thursday morning, I received a call from Ethan Walker. His voice sounded different, more serious. "Where are you?" "At the ranch. You might want to come down to the boat ramp." I looked up from my desk. "Why? Diane's down here." That wasn't surprising. The next sentence was, "And she brought the sheriff." I stood immediately. 20 minutes later, my pickup rolled into the gravel parking area beside the community boat ramp. Half the neighborhood seemed to be there. Golf carts lined the roadside. Residents stood in clusters. People were filming with their phones. At the center of it all stood Diane Whitmore. She looked completely confident. A stack of papers sat under one arm. Greg Dalton stood beside her. Both looked like they had been preparing for this moment. Then I saw the sheriff, Nolan Briggs, tall, gray-haired, respected, the kind of man who spoke very little because he never needed to repeat himself. As I stepped from the truck, Diane spotted me immediately. "There he is." Several heads turned. The crowd parted slightly. I walked toward them. No hurry, no anger, just curiosity. Sheriff Briggs nodded. "Mr. Mercer, Sheriff." Diane stepped forward before either of us could say another word. "This is the individual I reported." The sheriff glanced at her. "Reported for what exactly?" Her confidence flickered for a second, then returned. "Repeated unauthorized use of HOA property." She pointed dramatically toward the lake. "Fishing. Recreational activity. Refusal to comply with community regulations." The sheriff looked at me. "You fishing?" "Occasionally." A few people laughed. Diane didn't. She opened her folder and began producing documents. Violation notices, community regulations, meeting minutes, bylaws. Page after page. She handed them over as though sheer volume could substitute for evidence. The sheriff accepted them politely, then started reading. Several minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Finally, he looked up. "These are HOA regulations." Diane smiled. "Correct. Do you have the ownership records?" Her smile disappeared. The crowd became very quiet. "What ownership records?" she asked. "The deed." The sheriff's voice remained calm. "The document showing the HOA owns the lake." For the first time all morning, Diane looked uncomfortable. She shuffled through the folder. More papers emerged. Meeting notes, budget reports, maintenance schedules. Everything except what the sheriff requested. Sheriff Briggs waited. So did everyone else, including me. After nearly 30 seconds, Diane finally spoke. "The community has used this lake for years. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "The HOA maintains the area. That's not ownership either." People were starting to exchange glances. The mood had changed. Earlier, they expected enforcement. Now they were watching a different story unfold. The sheriff closed the folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have a deed?" "No." "A lease?" "No." "A management agreement?" "No." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Greg Dalton stared at the ground. Several residents looked openly confused. One older man near the boat ramp muttered, "Wait, we don't own it?" Diane heard him. Everyone did. She straightened immediately. "The ownership issue is irrelevant." The sheriff shook his head. "No, ma'am." His voice remained calm. "It is literally the only issue." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The words landed too hard. Diane's face flushed. For years, she had controlled every conversation in Maple Ridge Estates. Today, someone else was setting the rules, and those rules required evidence. The sheriff handed back the folder. "Based on what I've seen, this appears to be a civil ownership question." Diane looked stunned. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't remove people from property unless somebody proves ownership." A few residents nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Questions were spreading now. Dangerous questions. The kind that don't disappear. Diane made one last attempt. "He's violating community regulations." Sheriff Briggs looked directly at her. "Then prove the community owns the property." Silence. Again. Longer this time. The crowd felt different now. Not hostile, not supportive, just uncertain. Doubt had entered the room. And once doubt arrives, authority starts leaking out of every crack. The sheriff tipped his hat toward me. "Mr. Mercer." "Sheriff." Then he turned and walked back toward his cruiser. The conversation was over. No citation. No warning. No removal. No victory for Diane. Just questions. Lots of questions. As residents slowly began dispersing, I noticed something unusual. People weren't talking to Diane anymore. They were talking to each other. And almost every conversation seemed to revolve around the same thing. Ownership. Proof. Documents. The exact subjects Diane had spent years avoiding. I climbed into my truck. Before I could close the door, Ethan appeared beside me. "You know what just happened?" I looked at him. "I've got a feeling." He smiled. For the first time, people saw her get asked a question she couldn't answer. I started the engine, then glanced once more toward the lake, toward Diane, toward Greg, toward the growing uncertainty spreading through Maple Ridge Estates. The sale wasn't finished yet. The lake wasn't mine yet. But the balance of power had shifted, and judging by the look on Diane Whitmore's face, she had finally realized something was happening. She just didn't know what. Not yet. The strangest part wasn't what happened after the sheriff left. It was what I didn't do. I didn't send emails. I didn't post documents online. I didn't confront Diane at HOA meetings. I didn't explain myself to the neighbors. I simply disappeared. At least that's how it looked from the outside. The weekly HOA meeting came and went. My chair remained empty. Another compliance notice arrived. I filed it away. A community newsletter accused unnamed residents of attempting to undermine neighborhood stability. I ignored it. The silence bothered people, especially Diane. People understand anger. They understand arguments. They understand retaliation. Silence makes them nervous, because silence leaves room for imagination. And imagination is usually worse than reality. 3 days after the sheriff incident, Ethan Walker stopped by my ranch. He leaned against the fence and looked toward the lake. "You know, everyone thinks you're planning something." I smiled. "Everyone?" Pretty much. What does Diane think? Ethan laughed. She's trying to figure that out. That answer pleased me more than it should have. Because while Diane was trying to solve a mystery, the paperwork continued moving. The title search came back clean. No lawsuits, no ownership disputes, no hidden claims. Rachel called with updates every few days. Each conversation sounded better than the last. Then on the following Tuesday, she delivered the news I had been waiting for. The title commitment is approved. I set down my coffee. No issues? None. The answer came instantly. The lake can transfer. For several seconds, I simply stared through the kitchen window. After weeks of research, questions, records, and legal reviews, the finish line was finally visible. Not crossed, but visible. The sale would close soon. Very soon. Rachel lowered her voice. Keep this quiet. I wasn't planning a parade. I'm serious, Dad. So am I. Because if there was one thing I had learned from Diane Whitmore, it was that people reveal their intentions when they think they're winning. The less she knew, the more likely she was to make a mistake, and Diane was already making plenty of them. The fines had climbed past $2,000. Each notice sounded more aggressive than the last. One threatened collection actions. Another mentioned potential liens. None included ownership records. None referenced a deed. None explained why the HOA believed it controlled the lake. The threats were getting louder because the evidence wasn't getting stronger. That pattern mattered. Meanwhile, something else started happening around Maple Ridge Estates. Residents began asking questions. Not publicly. Not yet. But privately. One afternoon, I walked into the local hardware store and ran into Marcus Bennett, retired Army mechanic. Lived 2 streets over. Never cared much about HOA politics. He stopped me near the checkout counter. Can I ask you something? Sure. Does the HOA actually own that lake? There it was. The question. The same question Sheriff Briggs had asked. The same question Diane couldn't answer. I considered my response carefully. I'd recommend looking at the county records. Marcus studied me, then nodded slowly. That was all, but it was enough. Questions were spreading, and questions have a way of multiplying once they start. The following week, something happened that pushed Diane from concerned to worried. Survey trucks appeared, 3 of them, white pickups with company logos on the doors. They parked near the shoreline shortly after sunrise. Workers stepped out carrying equipment, tripods, measurement poles, boundary markers. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, unless you were watching from an HOA office. By lunchtime, half the neighborhood had seen them. By evening, everyone had. My phone rang repeatedly. Neighbors, friends, curious residents. I answered almost none of the calls. The surveyors returned the next day, and the day after that, driving stakes, recording measurements, walking the perimeter, mapping every inch of the shoreline. On Friday afternoon, Ethan called again. Diane followed one of the survey crews. I laughed. How'd that go? Not great. Apparently, Diane had demanded explanations. The survey supervisor politely informed her that he worked for a private client and couldn't discuss active property matters. She didn't like that answer. Not one bit. By Saturday morning, rumors had reached a fever pitch. Some people believed the county was taking over the lake. Others thought a developer planned to build waterfront homes. One resident apparently claimed the state was creating a wildlife preserve. The truth was much simpler and far more dangerous for Diane. Late that afternoon, Rachel called. Her voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Finality. It's done. I stood. Done? The closing documents are complete. My pulse quickened. When? Monday morning. I looked out toward Cedar Hollow Lake. The water reflected the late afternoon light. Quiet. Ordinary. Unchanged. For now. Rachel continued. 3 business days from now, everything changes. After we ended the call, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. Not celebrating. Not planning. Just thinking. Across the lake, I noticed movement near the HOA office. A familiar white SUV sat in the parking lot. Diane Whitmore. Even from a distance, I could tell she was watching the survey crews, watching the shoreline, watching the questions spread through the community, watching control slowly slip through her fingers. She knew something was happening. She just didn't know what. And in 3 days, she was going to find out in the most public way possible. Because when the survey crews returned next week, they wouldn't be bringing measuring equipment. They'd be bringing something else. Signs. Monday morning started with 3 trucks parked along the eastern shoreline of Cedar Hollow Lake. Not survey vehicles this time. Installation crews. By 8 o'clock, steel posts were being driven into the ground at every major access point. The first sign went up near the boat ramp, the second beside the walking trail, the third at the northern shoreline entrance. By 9 o'clock, half the neighborhood had gathered to watch. I stayed back near my truck, coffee in one hand, hands in my pockets. No speech prepared. No announcement planned. The signs could speak for themselves. The first one was impossible to miss. Private property. Cedar Hollow Lake Parcel 4 2-1178. Owner Jack Mercer authorized access only. Several people read it twice. A few took photographs. One woman actually walked up and touched the metal as if she expected the words to disappear. They didn't. Because unlike HOA notices, these signs weren't based on assumptions. They were based on recorded ownership. My phone buzzed. Rachel. County recorder updated the database 30 minutes ago. I smiled. So it's official. It's very official. The transaction had closed at 8:12 a.m. 42 acres, lake, shoreline, buffer zone, everything, legally transferred, recorded, indexed, public. For the first time since receiving the fishing citation, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not victory, not yet, just certainty. The uncertainty was gone. The facts were no longer hiding inside legal files. Now they stood in plain view. At 10:17 a.m., Diane Whitmore arrived. She didn't park. She stopped. The white SUV came to a hard halt near the main sign. For nearly 30 seconds, she simply stared through the windshield. Then she climbed out. Fast. The crowd immediately noticed. Conversations stopped. Phones came out. People sensed something important was about to happen. They were right. Diane marched straight toward me. Not toward the sign. Not toward the installation crew. Toward me. Greg Dalton followed a few steps behind, looking significantly less confident than usual. Diane stopped 3 feet away. What is this? I took a sip of coffee. The sign explains it. Her eyes narrowed. You don't have authority to put these here. I do. This is HOA property. No. Her voice rose immediately. Remove them. Several residents were now openly watching. Marcus Bennett stood near the trail entrance. Ethan Walker leaned against his pickup. Nobody interrupted. Nobody helped. They simply watched. Diane pointed toward the shoreline. I am ordering you to remove these immediately. That word caught my attention. Ordering. Still acting like ownership belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. I nodded toward my ranch house. Come inside. That surprised her. For a moment she hesitated, then followed me. Greg came too. The three of us entered the dining room. Everything was already waiting on the table. A recorded deed, county transfer confirmation, title documents, parcel maps, tax records. The entire paper trail. I slid the top document across the table. Diane picked it up. At first her expression remained confident. Then she reached the ownership section. The confidence disappeared. She read it again. Slower this time. Her eyes moved directly to the name. Jack Mercer. Owner. Parcel 4, 2-1178, Cedar Hollow Lake. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Greg looked over her shoulder. His face turned pale. Diane set the document down, then immediately picked it back up. I had seen that reaction before. People do it when reality refuses to match expectation. That's impossible. No. I pointed toward the county recorder stamp. It's recorded. She continued reading. Every page made the situation worse. Transfer documents, title commitment, tax settlement, legal descriptions, everything. The room became very quiet. Not the comfortable silence of certainty, the uncomfortable silence of collapse. Finally, Diane lowered the papers. When did this happen? Today. Greg spoke for the first time. The HOA wasn't notified. I looked at him. Why would it be? Neither had an answer. Because there wasn't one. The lake had never belonged to them. There was no legal requirement to inform people who possessed no ownership interest. Diane seemed to realize that, and she hated it. The anger arrived first, then disbelief, then something else. Fear. Because for the first time since this started, she wasn't facing a resident. She was facing a deed. And deeds don't care about arguments. She stood abruptly. This isn't over. I nodded. Okay. She wanted resistance. Instead, she got agreement. That seemed to frustrate her even more. Without another word, she turned and headed for the door. Greg followed. By the time they reached the driveway, residents had already started approaching the signs, reading them, photographing them, talking. As Diane drove away, I noticed something important. Nobody followed her. Nobody gathered around her. Nobody asked for instructions. Instead, they remained near the signs, near the documents, near the facts. And for the first time since this started, the community wasn't asking whether Diane was right. They were asking how long she had known she was wrong. By sunset, the signs had become the most discussed subject in Maple Ridge Estates. But something told me Diane Whitmore wasn't finished, not even close. Because people who build authority on assumptions rarely surrender when the truth appears. They escalate. And Diane had just lost control of the one thing she spent years pretending to own. The question now wasn't whether she'd fight back. It was how far she was willing to go. I got the answer 2 days later. The first flyer appeared in a mailbox on Willow Creek Drive. Then another. Then another. By Friday morning, copies were circulating throughout Maple Ridge Estates. Someone slipped one under my front door. I unfolded it at the kitchen table. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Save our community lake." The rest was exactly what I expected. It described a private individual taking control of a shared neighborhood resource. It warned about lost access, lost traditions, lost property values. My name never appeared. It didn't need to. Everyone knew who the flyer was about. What interested me wasn't what the flyer said. It was what it left out. No mention of the deed. No mention of ownership records. No mention of the dissolved development company. No mention of the fact that the HOA had never owned the lake. The omissions were becoming a pattern. By lunchtime, the story had spread across neighborhood social media pages. Residents argued in comment sections. Some sided with Diane, others wanted answers. Many simply seemed confused, which was understandable. For years, they'd been told the lake belonged to the community. Now signs claimed otherwise. Most people didn't know who to believe. That uncertainty was exactly where Diane wanted them. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Facts don't. My phone buzzed. Rachel, have you seen the flyers? One sitting in front of me. Good. That wasn't the response I expected. Good? Because now she's committed. I smiled. Lawyers think differently than engineers. Rachel wasn't looking at the accusation. She was looking at the record. Everything she's publishing can be preserved. There was a brief pause, especially if she knows the ownership documents exist. That mattered. A lot. By that evening, Ethan Walker stopped by the ranch. He brought 3 different versions of the same flyer, each one slightly more dramatic than the last. Diane's working overtime. I looked through them. Every version told the same story. Jack Mercer stole the community lake. Not legally, not directly, but emotionally. The narrative wasn't about ownership. It was about betrayal. Unfortunately for Diane, narratives don't survive contact with documentation. And I had plenty of documentation. The following morning, Rachel and I made a decision. We stopped staying quiet. Not emotionally, not publicly, just factually. We assembled everything. The recorded deed, county transfer confirmation, tax records, parcel history, corporate dissolution records, the denied request Diane submitted 3 years earlier. Every document, every filing, every piece of evidence. Then we uploaded the entire package to a simple public web page. No commentary, no accusations, no speeches. At the top sat a single sentence. All ownership documents relating to Cedar Hollow Lake are available for public review below. That was it. Nothing else. The documents did the talking. The response was immediate. By afternoon, residents were reading. Not rumors. Records. Not opinions. Paperwork. The first call came from Marcus Bennett. I just finished reading everything. And a long pause. Then she knew. There it was. The conclusion people eventually reached when they followed the paper trail. Not everyone, but enough. By evening, the conversations had changed. Residents stopped asking whether the lake belonged to me. That question was settled. Now they were asking why the HOA had claimed ownership for years. The pressure started shifting, away from me, toward Diane. The next sign of trouble appeared Saturday morning. A woman named Janet Kowalski knocked on my door. I recognized her immediately. She had served on a landscaping committee Diane created years earlier. Normally, she avoided controversy. Today, she looked uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. I invited her inside. She remained near the doorway. I believed what she said. I nodded. Most people did. Janet looked down. Not anymore. That conversation repeated itself several times over the next few days. Different neighbors. Same realization. The facts were changing minds. Not because I was persuasive, because records are hard to argue with, especially public records. Meanwhile, Diane became increasingly aggressive. More posts, more emails, more accusations. The volume increased. The evidence didn't. Every day the gap grew wider. One side produced documents, the other produced outrage, and eventually people noticed the difference. Tuesday afternoon brought the biggest shift yet. Ethan called. You're going to want to hear this. What happened? Tom Fletcher, the HOA treasurer, the same man who had looked nervous weeks earlier. What about him? He walked out of a board meeting. That got my attention. Walked out? Argument with Diane. I stood. What kind of argument? No idea. But half the board heard it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because organizations start breaking apart long before they collapse. The cracks appear first. Then people start choosing sides. Then somebody talks. I thanked Ethan and ended the call. As the sun disappeared beyond the lake, I sat on the porch reviewing another stack of HOA emails, each one louder than the last, each one weaker than the last. Across the water, lights glowed inside the HOA office. Someone was still there, probably Diane, still fighting, still pushing, still trying to control a story that was slipping away. But she had another problem now. The community wasn't listening the way it used to. People were asking questions, reading documents, comparing claims against records, and somewhere inside the HOA itself, someone had started talking. The only question was what they knew, and how much of it they were willing to share. I got part of the answer at 2:17 in the morning. The alert tone from my phone pulled me awake instantly. Not because it was loud, because I knew exactly what it meant. 3 weeks earlier, after the signs went up, Rachel had convinced me to install a full camera system around the lake access points and shoreline boundaries. 6 cameras, cloud storage, motion alerts, every entrance covered. At the time, it felt precautionary. Now it felt necessary. I picked up the phone and opened the app. 2 figures were moving across the eastern shoreline. Both wore dark jackets. One carried something long and metallic. The other kept looking over his shoulder. I sat upright. This wasn't a mistake. Nobody accidentally wandered onto private property carrying tools at 2 in the morning. I switched to another camera, then another. The system tracked them clearly. One of the men stopped beside a survey marker. A moment later, he pulled it from the ground. The second walked directly toward one of the steel ownership signs. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from certainty. I knew exactly what I was watching. Trespassing, property damage, evidence. I called 911. Then I returned to the live feed. The men moved closer to a shoreline light. The image sharpened, and suddenly I recognized one of them. Greg Dalton, the HOA secretary. I stared at the screen. Not someone who looked like Greg. Not maybe Greg. Greg. The second man took off his hood. I recognized him too. Tyler Mason, 24 years old, son of HOA board member Karen Mason. I recorded everything. Then I waited. 3 minutes later, headlights appeared on the access road. Sheriff Nolan Briggs had clearly taken the call seriously. 2 patrol vehicles rolled in without sirens. The men never saw them coming. Greg noticed first. He dropped the survey marker and ran. Unfortunately for him, darkness and uneven ground make poor allies. One camera caught him tripping over a tree root and crashing into the grass. Tyler froze where he stood, a can of spray paint still in his hand. Within moments, both were detained. I drove down to the shoreline carrying my laptop. Sheriff Briggs met me beside the patrol vehicles. "You have footage?" 6 angles. His eyebrows rose. I opened the recordings. Time-stamped, clear, continuous, no gaps. The sheriff watched quietly, then replayed part of the video. Greg pulling up the survey stake, Tyler approaching the sign, Tyler shaking the spray can. The evidence spoke for itself. By the end of the review, Sheriff Briggs closed the laptop. "That'll do." Neither suspect had much to say after that. By sunrise, the entire neighborhood knew. Greg Dalton had been arrested for criminal trespass and property damage. Tyler faced charges as well. The story spread faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Because this time there were photographs, incident reports, police records, facts. By 9 o'clock, Rachel was already involved. By noon, civil claims had been prepared. And by evening, the first real crack inside the HOA became impossible to ignore. Tom Fletcher called me directly. The HOA treasurer, the same man who had walked out of the board meeting, the same man who had looked nervous weeks earlier. His voice sounded exhausted. "I think you should see something." I didn't interrupt. Tom continued. "I kept copies." "Copies of what?" A long silence followed. Then he answered. "Board records." That got my attention immediately. "What kind of records?" "Meeting minutes." Another pause. "Emails." I said nothing. Tom lowered his voice. Diane knew. There it was again. The phrase everyone was slowly discovering. But this time it came from inside the organization itself. Tom explained that 3 years earlier, after the denied management rights request, the board had received a legal memo. The memo explicitly stated the HOA possessed no ownership interest in Cedar Hollow Lake. No deed, no easement, no management authority. Nothing. The board discussed it. The minutes reflected it. The records existed. And Diane attended every meeting. Meaning she had known all along. Not suspected. Known. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because the information surprised me, because it confirmed everything. The fines, the threats, the sheriff call, the newsletters. Every action had been built on knowledge, not misunderstanding. Tom emailed the documents 20 minutes later. Rachel reviewed them immediately. Her response arrived less than an hour afterward. "This is devastating." She was right. The documents changed the entire story. Until now, Diane could claim confusion, interpretation, miscommunication. Not anymore. Now there was proof, written proof, dated proof, board-approved proof. The next morning, residents woke up to 2 headlines circulating through Maple Ridge Estates. The first involved Greg Dalton's arrest. The second involved internal HOA records showing Diane Whitmore had known for years that the HOA never owned the lake. For the first time since this began, the conversation wasn't about me. It wasn't about fishing. It wasn't even about the lake. It was about Diane, and whether she could survive what was coming next. Because once the truth reaches every homeowner, authority built on fiction tends to collapse very quickly. And an emergency HOA membership meeting had just been scheduled. The turnout was unlike anything Maple Ridge Estates had ever seen. Normally, a dozen residents attended HOA meetings, maybe 15 if there was a budget vote. This time, every chair was filled. People stood along the walls. Others waited near the back entrance. By the time the meeting started, more than 30 households were represented. The largest gathering in association history. I arrived early and took a seat near the rear of the room. Rachel sat beside me. Neither of us planned to speak unless necessary. At this point, the documents were doing all the talking. Diane Whitmore entered 5 minutes before the meeting began. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. Not defeated, not yet, but uncertain. The board members took their seats. One chair remained empty. Greg Dalton's. Nobody commented on it. They didn't need to. Everyone knew why it was empty. The meeting opened with procedural announcements. Then came the agenda item everyone was waiting for. Review of board conduct and confidence vote. The room became silent. Diane stood. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes. Community traditions. Neighborhood stewardship. Misunderstandings. Administrative errors. She used every phrase available except the one residents wanted to hear. Ownership. When she finished, Marcus Bennett stood. The room turned toward him. Marcus wasn't a dramatic man. He rarely spoke during meetings, which made his question even more effective. Can you show us any document proving the HOA ever owned Cedar Hollow Lake? The room froze. The same question. Again. The question that had followed Diane for weeks. The question Sheriff Briggs asked. The question the records answered. The question she never could. Diane adjusted the papers in front of her, then began talking about community expectations. Marcus interrupted. That's not what I asked. Several heads nodded. Diane shifted toward maintenance expenses. Someone else interrupted. Do you have a deed? Another resident raised a hand. An easement? A woman near the front added. A management agreement. One question became 3, then 5, then 10. Every path led back to the same missing document. The room wasn't angry. It was worse. It was unconvinced. And once people stop believing, authority evaporates fast. Finally, Tom Fletcher stood. The former treasurer looked exhausted, but determined. He carried a folder. Everyone watched as he opened it. I think the membership deserves to hear this. The room went completely silent. Tom read portions of the board minutes, then the legal memo, then the correspondence regarding the denied transfer request. Every document said the same thing. The HOA possessed no ownership interest in Cedar Hollow Lake. The board knew. The records existed. The warnings existed. And Diane attended every meeting. By the time Tom finished reading, nobody was speaking, not even Diane. The silence lasted almost 30 seconds. Then the confidence vote began. Paper ballots, simple process, no speeches, no arguments, no drama, just residents making a decision. The counting took less than 10 minutes. When the final number was announced, nobody looked surprised. 23 votes in favor of removal, 8 against. Diane Whitmore was no longer HOA president. The room remained quiet. No cheering, no celebration. Just relief sometimes. That's more powerful. Over the next few weeks, the rest happened quickly. 2 additional board members resigned. Greg formally stepped down. Tyler accepted responsibility in court and entered a plea agreement. The civil claims settled, restitution was paid, the legal matters closed. Most importantly, the new HOA leadership approached me. Marcus Bennett had become interim president. He arrived at my ranch one afternoon carrying a folder. We'd like to start over. I invited him inside. The conversation lasted less than an hour, because Rachel and I had already prepared a solution. A formal lake access agreement. Clear, simple, lawful. Residents could continue walking the shoreline. Fishing, kayaking, non-motorized recreation. No fees, no permits. No HOA enforcement. Just basic conduct rules and respect for private property. Marcus read every page carefully, then signed. So did I. The conflict that had consumed the neighborhood for months ended at a dining room table with 2 signatures, exactly where most property disputes should end. 6 months later, I sat in the same folding chair where this story began. Same shoreline, same fishing rod, same lake. But everything else felt different. Children laughed near the walking path. A father helped his son untangle a fishing line. 2 kayaks drifted quietly along the western shoreline. No one worried about permits. No one worried about fines. No one worried about false authority. The lake belonged to someone, and everyone finally knew who. Marcus sat nearby with his own rod in the water. After a while, he looked over and asked, "You ever regret any of it?" I considered the question honestly, then shook my head. No. Even after everything? I looked across Cedar Hollow Lake, at the people using it, at the peace that had finally returned. Then I answered, "Not because I won." Marcus waited. "Because the truth won." He nodded. Neither of us said much after that. We didn't need to. A moving truck rolled through the neighborhood several weeks later. Diane Whitmore had sold her house. By noon it was gone. Just another vehicle disappearing down the road. No ceremony, no announcement, no final confrontation. Which felt appropriate, because this story was never really about a fishing fine, or even a lake. It was about a simple lesson that too many people forget. Authority doesn't come from titles. It doesn't come from newsletters. It doesn't come from threats. Real authority survives contact with the records. And if someone is counting on you never checking the paperwork, that's usually the first place you should look. The $600 citation that started everything still sits in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. Not because of the amount, because of what's missing. The parcel number. The detail Diane left off because she never expected anyone to ask why. Turns out that missing line told the entire story. And in the end, a quiet man, a patient lawyer, and a public record database accomplished something no argument ever could. They replaced assumptions with proof, and that was enough.
If there's one lesson I take from these stories, is that the smallest detail can tell you the biggest truth. In my case, it was a missing person number on the fishing citation. I could have paid the fine, shaking my head, and moved on. Most people probably would have, but taking the time to read the records, ask questions, and verify the facts changed everything. Not because it created a fight, but because it revealed the reality that has been there all along. Blacks have a way of rewarding patience. Sometimes staining your brow doesn't mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means stay calm, garnering the facts, and letting the truth speak for itself. Whether it's a piece of land, a family legacy, or a symbol your right to be treated fairly, there's value in knowing what you're standing on and why it matters. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that the real story was completely different from what you were first taught? If so, drop a yes in the comments. And if you ever had to rely on paperwork, records, or simple persistence to protect something important, share your experience below. I read the comments, and I know a lot of folks here have stories worth telling. If you enjoy these stories about quiet determination, common sense, and people standing firm the right way, consider subscribing. There are plenty more HOA, ranch, and property price stories ahead, and I'll be glad to help you along for the next one.